to present Austin Faith Dialogue, brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries. In the weeks ahead, you will see these and other programs by various denominations.
Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs series at the crossroads of religion and life. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues in the area in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Join us now for this week's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
The African American community of 1992 faces many challenges. Health care is critical, legislative concerns long, and civil and quality of life issues great. Hello, I'm Valerie Bridgman Davis, a pastor at Bernard Full Community Church, and your host for today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. Today, I'm joined by Austinites Representative Wilhelmina Delco, a Democrat from Austin, Mr. Gary Bledsoe, a local attorney and president-elect for the state chapter of NAACP, and Mr. Charles Wallace of the Texas Department of Health with the TB Elimination Division. Welcome to all of you for being here with us. I'm really glad that we're going to be here. This is going to air in Black History Month, so we wanted to talk today about the state of the African American community as we look at Black History Month for 1992. I guess I want to start with, because we talked about maybe making some comparisons between the 1990s and the 1960s, 30 years later. What do you think? Are we better, worse, stagnant, at the same place, moving? Let's start with you, Gary, since you think quick on your feet.
Well, things are regressing, I hate to say. I think that the country had made some great strides, but because of difficult economic times, there's a bit of a backlash. And many things have happened in the 1980s in the employment sector, or we can see the rise of race discrimination again. We can see where a person who was the former head of the Ku Klux Klan received 55% of the white votes in Louisiana in a recent race, and would have received more if it wasn't for the extraordinary efforts of individuals from all sectors of that community, in particular the business community, that really kind of forestalled that campaign. So those things really indicate to me that there is indeed a problem that looms in the future for us who are trying to advance the interests of the African American. But many individuals don't quite understand what we're trying to do. We're just trying to get our fair share. We're trying to get equity. We're not trying to get something that we don't deserve. But for some reason, when we want to be included and to get our part of the pie, individuals say, well, that's my part of the pie, and there's a bit of a friction that is created. Okay,
the politician in him is coming out now, so I'm going to switch over to the healthcare issues, because we're going to come back to that. I think that there are a lot of concerns around that issue. What about healthcare, Mr. Wallace? Are we advancing, or?
I would say these were the best of times, these were the worst of times, or the worst of times. Healthcare at this particular point for the African American is probably at its lowest in the past 25 years. We see more homicides between young people than we've seen in many, many years, where young African American men are killing themselves at a greater rate. The ages 15 through 19 are critical because that's our youth, but they're dying from homicides at a greater rate. HIV infection, as you may have seen in also American Statesman, and homicides are the greatest killer of young African American men than any other particular illnesses or diseases. We also find that infant mortality rate is very high. Still 15 plus babies die, African American babies die compared to every 1,000 born in this state, and that's compared to 7 for Anglo babies and about 7.5 for Hispanic babies. That's a critical issue. Our kids are not surviving. Compared to the 60s, you may think we're on the downside of the cycle when it comes to survival. And I think very critically that if we don't do something to improve ourselves in the next recent years, we will become, as the dodo bird went, very extinct.
Ms. Delco, you have been a legislator now 16 years. tell me, what about the legislative advancements or stallings for African Americans?
On paper, it looks as if we're doing better, and I imagine in some aspects we are. We've got committee chairs, we've got people elected here in Austin on all levels of government. The problem is our community does not seem to be as involved. I think it's economic. When you talk about the perception of the increase in racism, I think our people have realized that one or two people don't necessarily make the difference. Where the promise was so great, most of the easy problems have been addressed and resolved. When you sat in at the lunch counters, you were served. Now the question isn't going to the lunch counter, it's having the money to pay for the tab when you're served. When we talk about health care, Austin, Texas has the largest number of young women, 15 years and younger, having babies. So when we talk about addressing both the problems of health and the problems of education, we've got a society that is no longer involved. Where we used to be the greatest example of the large family, now we're becoming increasingly like the nuclear family. People are working longer, making less, and being able to do less with what they make. Even when you look at our religious communities, more and more of our ministers who used to be able to devote all of their time to their ministries just to survive, in some cases just to keep their church doors open, have to work full time. So the sense of being able to have an anchor in our community is no longer there. The school is no longer an anchor.
I want to come back to the issue of the church being an anchor, and certainly school, because I do want you to speak to education. Gary started to say something about the piece of the pie, and I guess the question that came up in my mind was that there was a sense in which we were, quote, breaking barriers, and now I have more of a sense that what happened with many African Americans wasn't that we broke barriers, but that we slipped through the cracks. And the barriers are still there. Can you?
Well, the barriers are still there, and they've actually been reinforced in recent years. So we can see the increases that we were making actually starting to regress now, whether we're talking about succeeding to middle to upper level management positions in corporate America or in public employment, or whether we're talking about electability in different kinds of political races. There indeed has been a bit of a backlash, and it's causing serious problems today. But the one thing we're wanting to try to do about this with the NAACP is to try and get the churches involved, because ironically, when we see people who are guilty of discrimination, who wreak wrongs on people because of the color of their skin or because of their ethnic background, many of the people who commit these wrongs go to church and consider themselves to be Christian Americans. And for some reason, the pulpits haven't been addressing the issues of human rights and civil rights. And there's a great foundation for all of the things that we are pushing for in the Bible. And we're hoping to start a dialogue with the different faiths of all the churches throughout this city and hopefully throughout this state to see if we can't challenge the ministry to take this on as the righteous issue, not to join us as politically to push for legislation or what have you, to push for right and wrong and have people to be treated in the right way.
You know, Valerie, one of the things that really concerns me is that as we have problems increasing, the commitment to involvement in those problems is decreasing. We've got a larger number of people taking advantage or being forced into earlier retirement, and yet in our communities, we aren't really tapping that resource in our churches. The enormous number of youngsters in our community that are either turned out or turned off of education appropriately could be addressed in their churches where their grandmothers and their neighbors and their friends attend, to provide within the context of that environment reinforcement for real life situations. And yet we find that there are more people that are not involved in our community, not just, as Gary suggested, a commitment to the political involvement. Obviously, we would love that. But there are so many other things that our kids need where there is no longer that assumption that somebody at home or somebody next door
will do that.
Will do it.
Well, let's talk about that. Ms. Wallace, you were going to say.
I was going to say that I think there's such a tremendous push on the part of of our people to get out of the community once we've risen to a certain economic level. And I think there's such a dire need to have those who are able to get out, we'll say, come back and play a role in the redevelopment and restructuring that community. The other critical issue in communities is that the church has not had a chance, again, to think about so much, if they have thought about it, not to regenerate the involvement level that we had in the 60s and the 50s, to redevelop, restructure the community. And as a result of that, we're losing our communities. Our communities are not really owned by our people anymore. Our empowerment has been lost totally. Our self-esteem and desire to rebuild our communities is gone. We think back in the 60s again, that so much of that power and push to keep our communities safe and structured came from the church. The church had that kind of role to play in the community. And for some reason, it seems as though the churches are inward more toward keeping self intact inside and not reaching out. The only way our communities are going to survive is that the church take that role on again. Our ministers realize that they must play a strong part in holding our communities together, holding our people together. It's often said that the 11 o'clock hour is the greatest gathering of African-American people, and that's used in the church. That should be taken full advantage of.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I'm going to try not to be defensive as a pastor, but what I want you to speak to, because I think all of you have said, one of the things that happened is that there is a diaspora. The African-American community is diffused. There is not just those black people over in East Austin,
no.
Quote. We African-Americans, I live in South Austin, you live in North Austin, other people live, you know what I'm trying to say? East Austin, Northeast Austin, West Austin. What I'm saying, so there is some fallacy even in how we talk about the community.
Yeah.
So maybe, I don't know if we can even address that issue, but how do we...
But I do think that with maybe a few exceptions, a lot of our folks cross the Red Sea, which is I-35, and come back to East Austin to church. We have in our church people who live all over Austin. And I think that can be the gathering point. It was when people lived out in rural areas, everybody dressed up and drove miles to church. We had to build our own churches. We sustained our own churches. Our churches reached out and built our colleges. Our churches reached out and built our hospitals, and it was because of the fact that nobody else was doing it for us. And I suspect that if the church is going to recapture its mission, it has, first of all, to identify a sense of community. That people, once they come to church, and they do come to church, they don't just as soon as the sermon is over or the collection plate is passed, go back to their communities. There has to be something that pulls them in the name of their faith, back to church on other than 11 o'clock Sunday morning.
Well, speak to, Gary, if you can, I don't know if you can do this, what about those African Americans who are not worshiping over in East Austin? They're worshiping maybe in an integrated church somewhere in North Austin, but they still feel very connected to the African American community. Because I want to talk closer to the end toward how we may respond to non-African Americans who are watching this show, because that's probably the largest group of our audience, and we need to say something to it.
Well, I think it's important for the African American to attend the church that they desire to attend, and I think there's a great positive dividend to be had from them attending churches that are not predominantly African American churches. So I don't have a problem with that. They should give back in other ways, as Mr. Wallace indicated earlier, and they should have some connection with the community because they have a responsibility, in my opinion. I think what we need to do in that area is we need to reach out and get the people who aren't attending church now, because I think the numbers, and from what I've observed, are a lot greater. I think with the youth, they have somehow been divorced from the church. They don't see the need. It isn't quite the joining element or constituent element that it used to be in the African American community. And I think there might even be an income issue there, as far as the African American who doesn't attend may be on the lower part of the economic scale than the African Americans who do attend church. But the ones who don't attend are the ones who would need what the church can provide the most. So I think that the churches need to be a little bit more aggressive and try and get these people to start attending. And I've been very impressed with Reverend Lands and some things he's done with the Black Ministers Alliance, and trying to stop the flow of drugs in the community, and to try and get the kids off the streets during the week when they ought to be at home studying, and they're just hanging out. So I think those kinds of things the churches really need to to take on and start to do, and then they can be a lot more effective with the programs in place that Ms. Delco was talking about.
Let me suggest something, Valerie. A few years ago, when we first had the first thrust for desegregation in the Austin schools, at one of the schools there was really a very serious disturbance. And when the principal decided he had to call the police because the situation got out of hand, when the police actually arrived, the only students that were arrested or taken to the juvenile home were the African-American students. And that was simply because the other students could call home or walk home. Now, it seems to me appropriate that since near every school within usually fairly easy walking distance, there is a church of some kind, there needs to be a concerted citywide effort to make those comfortable places for students to go in times of need. No matter what that need is, it seems to me that the Christian community should be in loco parentis for students, because all of our students are in distress, and most of them are in home environments where if they got into a situation at school, it would be very difficult for them to connect with the community or the individual with which they are most comfortable. And that's tragic, because then those students either accelerate the problem, exacerbate the problem, or just deny the existence of the problem. So one of the things that the broader Christian community and church community at large ought to be about is becoming a real factor to people, whoever they are, wherever they are, and to have people feel comfortable in walking into that facility, knowing that there's going to be support for them there.
I think that's right. That's a pastor.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think the other thing that that must occur within our church family is that the church needs to ask itself if it's really truly its brother's keeper. In the health circle, I think we have some diseases that have arisen in our communities that many churches, many churchmen shy away from. HIV infection, no one wants to talk about that in the African American community. But in the state of Texas, very few people. Let me back up. Very few people really want to talk about it. Church people have a difficult time talking about it. Some church people have a difficult time talking about it. But in the state of Texas, 17% of the AIDS cases that have been identified and reported to the state health department are in African Americans. The bulk of the female cases that are reported are African American women. The bulk of the childhood cases reported are in African American children. Homicides, no one wants to face the homicide issue. 7,000 cases of cancer were reported in African Americans in the state of Texas on last year. These are critical things. The church has become an activist in a lot of ways. Because of the kind of problems we have in our African American community, the church cannot just stand back and say, we'll preach and we'll teach. But you must go out. They must go out.
Proactive.
And be very proactive. Because we are on a survival thing here. I preach this sermon, if you will, when I go into the community. And I'm not a preacher, but I preach this sermon because our survival, African American people's survival, as I see it, are dependent on how we fight this war of survival. And truly, it's a war. The policymakers that deal with healthcare issues and many of the other issues that we deal with are not African American and may decide not to take a proactive role in our survival. And because of that attitude, in many cases, we have to be the stimulators, perking our way up from the bottom to the top to influence the policymakers in making the right decisions.
Before we turn the corner, I want to just kind of recap for our audience some of the things that you said. One of the things that church could do is become a haven.
Yes.
A place whereby children, not just children, anyone can find a welcome mat, a place to go if it's nothing but to hide out. I think I've said on this show several times that I grew up with a parent who said, you can tell your friends your mama said you can't do it, you know, whereas I'm not sure that kids have that same kind of safety net anymore. You know what I'm trying to say? It used to be I could say, well, mama said I can't do it, and that meant something, you know. To the community. Then you said that about our health care issues. I know that there are several churches in East Austin who've had health fairs, for instance.
I think the pulpit has to speak to the issue of health care. It's nothing wrong as far as I'm concerned, and I'm a strong religious person, spiritual person. The preacher saying that we have this problem in our church, our problem, because many of the HIV cases are occurring in
our church, yes.
This problem is occurring in our community. We have to take a role in trying to change it. Our health is our responsibility. Our kids are not going to be educated if they're not healthy when they come to school. They got to be able to learn and receive. Those walking the streets are not going to survive unless they have proper health care, good education. And a strong sense of community rests with how our churches, I feel, push the issue of community and push the issues of health, push the issues of education, because the churchman is respected in the community.
Okay, but I want to go back to something Gary has said, which we just kind of scanned over, and you can't miss this, which is there is a large percentage of African Americans who are no longer in church. Well, they may be in some other religious circles other than Christian circles, but there are many who are in non-religious circles, period. How are we as the faith community, as people who care about them, as a community as a whole, going to address those issues? You want to say more about that, Gary? Or I think that's an important issue.
Well, I think there really needs to be an aggressive effort. I mean, going door to door, going to the areas where the people are who aren't attending church, and sitting down, letting the people know that that you care about them, and that we want you to start attending. Well, I mean, it's important. We really need to start getting these youth and other individuals into the church, because so many of the things, the loss of dignity, the loss of pride, the aloofness, or the fact that many are lost, are directly resulting, I think, from the lack of connection with some strong institution that is a positive thing in their life. Many of them don't have positive experiences at school, which is a main institution that they might have some connection with, and may not have a strong force at home in which to feel good about and to nurture them and to get some nurturing from. So what else is there? And many don't have the understanding to go to the church to go and get that. And so the church has to go to them because they may not have the knowledge themselves to get there.
Go ahead.
I think the key is you're welcome here. For young people, there is a socialization that is attractive to them. If young people are in sports, why can't the church be involved in sports? If young people like to dance and like to hold parties, or like to have fashion shows, or like to sew, or whatever they like to do, why can't that be a part of a church community? And why can't we welcome youngsters who are not a part of our faith, not make them feel like this is some gracious gift to an alien, but to someone who is welcome, whether they are a member of our church or not. You see, the perception is that this is a community for insiders. And if you're not one of us, you're not welcome. And I think that the assumption is that the way you get them in is to make them make a commitment to you. And I think it ought to be the other way around. And the school ought to be a focal point for the church. I think that around holidays, when that is such a desperate time for so many people, every church gives baskets at Thanksgiving or little gifts and efforts. I think we ought to have that as an ongoing effort. And we ought to be, anytime you see kids, there ought to be an open place where they can be comfortable, and that ought to be our church community.
You want to add to that, Mr. Wallace?
I would say I totally agree with what Gary and Representative Delco has said. If the drug pusher can recruit our kids to run drugs, if they can recruit our kids to be prostitutes, and so on down the line, why is it so difficult for the church to recruit our kids to be good spiritual people in the church? We have an awful lot to offer. There's an awful lot we can offer that we are not offering right now. I really like what you said, Representative Delco. The other thing is that we need to have more mentors coming from our church to show these young people that the church is not a bad place to be. There's an awful lot you can get from the church, at least I feel strongly that way. But our kids need to know that there are people who are receiving and can transmit to them the good qualities the church has to offer. We're fighting a tremendous battle against the various things outside, the drugs and what, so on and so on. But we must fight this battle with all the forces we have, or we're going to lose our kids totally.
We are running out of time, so I want to turn a corner real quick and say, can we talk to the non-African American community? What I know for many years we've said we can't do this by ourselves, but I hear you saying, and I hear myself saying, well, we're going to have to be the starting point. But beyond the starting point, what do you say to non-African Americans who are watching this show and wondering if we have suddenly become all nationalist and whatever, separatist?
Well, I think the obligation of the non-African American is to be objective and to think and to not have what we would call a knee-jerk reaction to something they might see, and to observe and to put themselves in our position and to say, that if I were in that situation, what would I do? Because I think that once people are able to think or be sensitive to the interests and needs of another group, then maybe they can come to accept more of them and to understand them a lot better. I think one of the biggest problems in people being able to communicate with people in general is the inability of one person to be able to put themselves in the shoes of that other person and understand, why is this person doing this? Why do they need this? And I think that if the non-African American is able to try and put themselves in our shoes and to see our situation, and they would think, well, if I were in those shoes, I would probably do the same thing, and I would want to support them, or I would want them to support me, so maybe I should support them.
You know, within the church, there's a multitude of structured organizations, and it seems appropriate that there ought to be more dialogue between the existing organizations. There ought to be more exchanges. There ought to be more visits. There ought to be more opening of facilities. A lot of churches I've been to are very, very, very extravagant operations. And I think that in the instances where there are sports, there ought to be a cultivation of inter-church leagues and inter-church activities. There ought to be more visiting between churches. There ought to be more encouragement of joint operations between churches. Because as long as you've got this stereotypical image of them versus us, it will never break down, because you always can excuse what you do and explain what somebody else does. So it is critically important for the church to take the leadership in breaking down those stereotypes, breaking down those images, and as Gary suggested at the very beginning, break down some of those barriers. It's going to take an affirmative action, but the structure's there if the commitment is.
I think one of the beauties of the state of Texas, and indeed many parts of the country, is our multiculturalism. And I think a blending of cultures makes for a better product. It's cheaper to work with one another than it is to work separately. It's better to assist churchmen, for sure, to assist one another in making sure that problems are resolved. We cannot resolve the issues by ourselves, and I certainly don't want that message to go out to anyone. This is a problem that's a community problem, an Austin community problem. And unless we deal with it as a community problem, we're going to be in trouble. So we're reaching out a hand, I think is what I can say to the community at large, to invite you in to be a part of us resolving our issues, be they health, be they education, be they community in general. There's no reason that we should separate ourselves out and not work together on these issues.
Well, I think the church has heard the Macedonian call, come over and help us, as Paul dreamed in Acts. I'm really glad to start Black History Month with this group of people. Thank you, Gary Bledsoe, who is here with us, and Representative Wilhelmina Delco, thank you, and Mr. Wallace, Charles Wallace from the Health Department. I appreciate all three of you for being prophets to us this week. Now, as we come to a close to today's show, I'm really glad they were here, and I hope that our audience heard something that evoked in them a call to be involved in the community. On behalf of Austin Faith Dialogue, I'm Valerie Bridgman Davis, thanking you for being with us and inviting you to be with us again this time next week. Peace to you.
For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-7627.